Today's daf we're going to be learning is Horayot daf Zayin. As I've mentioned before, another few days we're going to already have a siyum. So the siyum will be Sunday. The details should be sent out today. Zrat Hashem. We have a great program lined up with a lot of our regular teachers. We have Dr. Lana Stein-Hain, Dr. Ayala Hoffman-Lipson, and Yael Shimoni, Rabbani Yael Shimoni from Gefet. So we have a lot of powerhouse of shiurim, high-level shiurim, and for anyone, I'll keep repeating that for anyone who's in Jerusalem and wants to join our big event, please register. The details are on the Hebrew site. You can find it on the homepage, and you can register for the siyum there to come to the live event. Okay, the registration for the English siyum will go up later today, and you can also, it should be found hopefully on the homepage. Okay, with that, we will get started. And we appreciate, by the way, we've seen people have sent feedback, and we know there's issues that need working out. We're working on first the urgent issues, then the less pressing issues, and Bezrat Hashem, over time, the website will be everything that everybody wants, or close to anyway. So keep providing feedback, though, even if we don't get back to you right away. It's because the more pressing things are urgent and getting dealt with first, which is the daily post, that there's still some issues going on with that, but once we get through that, we'll get to all the bigger, other issues as well. Okay, starting with, and by the way, at the siyum, okay, this is another good reason to join our siyum, we're going to have a bit of a tutorial on how to use the new website. So that will be at the end of the siyum. Maggie will do a tutorial on how different features, how you can use it. So highly recommended that you come and see, and we'll also pass it around once the siyum's over, but that'll be also something to look forward to at the siyum on Sunday. Okay, we're going to start from the bottom of Vav Amud Bet. What we started learning yesterday is the Kohen HaMashiach. And as we said, we'll just review this again. There's really 6 sections in the Torah about our topic. So there's 4 sections in Vayikra. This is very important. Today's a good day to kind of make some order out of all this. There's 4 sections in Vayikra Daled. It starts with the Kohen HaMashiach, who sins, who's really the Kohen gadol. We then move to the Par Helim Davar Shel Tzibor, which we spent a lot of time on already, which is the communal sin offering. Then the nasi, which we'll get to later, which is the king. And then the regular individual who sins. From there, we move to Bamidbar. Bamidbar, after it really talks about the Par Helim Davar Shel Tzibor in Vayikra, and it says, if you do one of the mitzvot, remember we talked about in the it's only from something, but part of a mitzvah, but it's one mitzvah. Then we move to Bamidbar, and the section Bamidbar is talking about Avodah Zarah, but it never actually says Avodah Zarah. Okay, that's like we learned about the par and the seir, right? That if it's Avodah Zarah, you bring a par and seir, and that comes from Bamidbar. Now the psukim in Bamidbar start off like this, okay, and today we're going to learn them a little more in depth. V'chi tishku, we're in Bamidbar chapter 15, verse 22. And there's 2 sections. That's why I said altogether 6. There's 4 in Vayikra, 2 in Bamidbar. It says, "V'chi tishku v'lo tasu et kol hamitzvot ha'ele asher diber Hashem al Moshe." If you make a mistake and don't do all of the mitzvot, that sounds crazy, right? How could you not do all of the mitzvot? So the rabbis obviously say it's not talking about all the mitzvot. What it's talking about? Avodah Zarah. Why Avodah Zarah? Because it's like all the mitzvot. It's very serious. Okay. Now, right, back to Masechet Avodah Zarah. So that section they learn is specifically talking about a sin having to do with Avodah Zarah. So it's like the parallel, but specifically Avodah Zarah. And there's a par and a seir. Okay, that's what we learned already. And then, and by the way, the wording there is similar. We're going to darshan Gzera Shevet today. It says, "V'hayai me'enei ha'edah ne'aseh l'shchila," from the eyes of the Eidah, which also said, "V'ne'elam davar me'enei ha'kahal in Vayikra," that from their eyes they didn't see it. So that's number 1. Then we move on to the second section, which starts from verse 27. If one person sins, they bring an ez for chatat, etc. Okay, so then there's a special korban you're going to bring, which is they actually call a seirah in the Gemara. It's a female goat. That's now what we're going to learn today is, notice there's no kohen, nasi, or anything else. The kohen and the nasi and the individual all bring that same korban. Okay? So now, here starts our Gemara. Our Mishnah started with saying that the kohen, it kind of was obvious that the kohen teaches and then the kohen does an action, right? They teach a ruling and then do an action. So the Gemara wants to know, right? And then the Mishnah ended with, because Horayot kohen Mashiach latzmo, Horayot beit din l'tzibor. This is a comparison we're going to talk about a lot today. We compare the kohen and Mashiach to the parhel and davar shel tzibor. Okay, and that, I mentioned this already in class before, the daf mishalahen last week. Okay, this week actually it's all about the kohen and the nasi comparison. Last week's daf mishalahen was all about a daf of their own. It was all about Rabbanot Shira and Chamuta, all about this idea, or at least part of it. One of the things they talked about was this idea that it splits into two. There's the kohen Mashiach and the parhel and davar shel tzibor, and then there's the yachid and the nasi. Theoretically, you would have thought there's the tzibor, one is the community, and then we have three individuals, and that's all in one category. But what you're going to see today is that really what the basis of what they were talking about, why the kohen Mashiach is really viewed more like the court, okay? And it's more like the tzibor in the court, the difference being that when and we'll see this inside today, but that in the court case, right, the parhel and davar shel tzibor, the court rules, the people act. In the kohen case, the kohen rules, the kohen acts. And that's what we saw in the Mishnah yesterday. So now, the Gemara wants to know, Minan Emile, where do we get this from? Okay, starting from the bottom, and it's not really on those words, it's really on the last words of the Mishnah. That Horayot kohen Mashiach latzmo, his teaching to himself and his action to himself is comparable to the parhel and davar shel tzibor case, which is a communal offering, in the sense that, and we're going to see it in a lot of senses today, in what sense is it similar, in what sense is it different, but it's similar in the sense right now we're talking about that there has to be a mistaken ruling and an action, right? As opposed to the individual and the nasi, the king who bring the individual sin offering or the king's sin offering, is just they made a mistake. They ate a piece of chaylev thinking it was not. No ruling, no anything, right? For the kohen to bring this special par has to be a ruling of the kohen himself, and then he acts upon his own ruling. So where do we get this from? Minan Emile. Ditanu Rabbanan la'ashmat ha'am. Okay, and this is where it really all starts. The pasuk of the kohen says, Daber b'nei Yisrael limor, nefesh ki tachta b'shgaga mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo te'asena, v'asar chat mehena, and he does one of them. Im ha'kohen ha'mashiach yachta la'ashmat ha'am. If the kohen who's anointed sins to the guilt of the nation. The simple reading of this pasuk is fascinating. Simple reading of this pasuk, okay, we have to think about the kohen gadol in general. Okay, it's good to do a bit of a zoom out today. Kohen gadol holds a certain position in the community. Now, usually you think of the kohen gadol, you think of Yom Kippur, right? You think of, or coming up on that, you think of his role in the temple. Sacrifices, providing atonement for the people. But besides that, he held also, okay, we saw in last week's Parsha, in Parshat Shoftim, it talks about the kohen, right? The kohen is also one of the leaders, okay? And there's a Zaken Mamre section, right? You go to the kohen, the shofet, hayasher yeh bayamim hahem. The kohen also held a position like the court. And the kohen not only held a position like the court, but if you go to where the other place where the kohen gadol features prominently is in Rotzach b'shgaga, an accidental murder. If you remember what happens, at the death of the kohen gadol, all the accidental murders go free. Why? Because his death atones for the people. So if you look at him in all these roles, the kohen's role is to be atoning for the people, okay? As in the temple, and even in his death, he atones for them. And therefore, with the simple reading of this pasuk is, when the kohen gadol sins, it's a reflection on the people, or it affects the people, because he's Mr. Atonement for everybody. And now he sins, he needs atonement, that's bad for the people, right? If he's the one who's atoning for everybody and he did something wrong, that's going to filter down to the people. But that's not the way the Gemara takes it. But that's definitely an idea to have in your head about why the Kohen Gadol stands different from everyone else. So now it says, Ditanu Rabbanan la'ashmat ha'am. What do we learn from this? Totally different than what I just said. Harei Mashiach ketzibur. La'ashmat ha'am means he's like the guilt of the people. In other words, when the people are guilty, which is in the parhel and davar shel tzibor, the Kohen Gadol is like that. So whatever's true for them is true for him. Okay, that's the drasha. Now we're going to leave the drasha for a minute, and the braita is going to go on a very long tangent, or a very long argument. They're going to say, She'achol b'halo dinhu. Now you might have just thought, the whole thing is, you often do this, they learn something from a pasuk and say, why do you need the pasuk? You could have just learned this from a logical argument. Okay, dinu is always a logical argument. Sometimes it's a kal v'chomer. In this case, it's what we call a binyan av, a paradigm. You would have just said like this. We have a paradigm for par helim davar shel tzibur. And why wouldn't we just say that the kohen has similar things to the par helim davar shel tzibur, and therefore whatever's true for the par helim davar shel tzibur should be true for the kohen, and you don't need a special drasha. Okay, here goes our argument. Tzibur mutzal michlal yachid, u'mashiach mutzal michlal yachid. There's a classic case of an individual who sins. Now, there's an exception to the rule. What's that? The community. There's an exception to the rule, the kohen gadol. Okay, so these are two exceptions to the rule. Okay, they're obviously ignoring the third exception to the rule, the nasi. We'll get back to that. But right now, they're going to say, these two are the same. They're both exceptions to the rule. Matziboring. So now we're going to just do, okay, whatever's true for the tzibur is true for the kohen. Matzibor ein chayavim elal halem davar im shigat maaseh. In order to be chayav the par helim davar shel tzibur, there has to be first a mistaken erroneous ruling, right? The unwitting erroneous ruling, and then the people unwittingly followed the ruling, not realizing it was a mistake. So, af Mashiach lo yeh chayav elal halem davar im shigat maaseh. So you must need those two criteria for the kohen as well. There has to be some sort of unwitting erroneous ruling and some sort of unwitting action. And in the case of the kohen, it's going to be he does both, and in the case of the community, it's going to be the court and the people. But it's the same idea. Then the Gemara says the obvious, which is, well, if you want to make a paradigm from the tzibur to the kohen Mashiach, or maybe you would go the other way, which is nasi mutzah michlal yachid, or Mashiach mutzah michlal yachid. We have a different exception. Also the nasi, who's the king. The king is an exception to the rule. Now, nobody thinks that when the nasi brings the special unique korban the nasi is supposed to bring, that it's specifically on a helem davar, on an erroneous ruling. No. So just like he brings it just because he's like the individual, they both just accidentally ate a piece of chaylev, not realizing it was chaylev, for example. So af Mashiach, so we'll say the same thing. And almost more logical to compare the individual king to the individual kohen gadol. So af Mashiach mevi b'shigat maaseh below ha'elim davar. So now they say, well, let's keep going in this logic. Near elim midomeh. To who is the kohen more similar? Now we're going to go back. We're going to seesaw back to more similar to the tzibur. Why? Tzibur bipal. Okay, there's two similarities. First of all, the par is what the kohen Mashiach brings, and the par is what the community brings. The nasi has a different korban entirely. It doesn't bring a bull offering. The bull offering is the same. Okay, so you say there's par for the tzibur and there's a par for the kohen gadol. So tzibur bipal, and another similarity, which we'll see later, at the very end of this section before we get to the next Mishnah, they're going to go back to this line and say, where do we get this from? Ve'em mevi'im hasham talui. Mashiach bipar ve'em mevi'im hasham talui. These are the two similarities between the tzibur and the Mashiach, that if the whole community accidentally eats a piece of fat that they weren't sure, okay, so first they ate it, they didn't know anything. Then they find out, that piece might have been chaylev. They don't bring an asham talui. Okay, if it's an individual, the individual brings an asham talui. The nasi would bring an asham talui, but the kohen Mashiach doesn't bring an asham talui, and the community doesn't bring an asham talui. Where we get this from, we're going to have to see. Okay, but right now, take it as a given. Two similarities: a par and asham talui. Par and asham talui. Okay, those two are similar to the two. So therefore, let's keep going with our same argument. Therefore, matzibor eno chayav elal halem davar mishigat maaseh. Just like the tzibur is not chayav, only if it's, and you need it to be both a mistaken erroneous ruling and shigat maaseh. Af Mashiach lo yeh chayav elal halem davar im shigat maaseh. There has to be an accidental erroneous ruling and a shigat maaseh, and then the people followed it, or someone followed it. In this case, the kohen gadol. Same thing. Oh, kilech l'derech zo. We're not finished, because remember what's going to happen. Okay. Where did we start? We started with, we needed drasha to teach us this. And then the Gemara said, couldn't you learn it by logic? So we're obviously going to keep going around in circles, because every time we're going to say, it would have been more logical to learn it from the tzibur, we're going to have to say, no, because on that same note, you could have learned it from the nasi. And in the end, we're going to say, and that's why you need the pasuk. Because logic is not going to get you to any conclusion. So if you're feeling dizzy by it, it's because this is a dizzying logic. We're going to keep going back and forth. Oh, kilech l'derech zo. Or maybe, say the opposite. Let's find some similarities between the nasi and the kohen Mashiach. Nasi mevi se'ira b'avodat kochavim. umevi asham vadai. Umashiach mevi sira b'avodat kochavim umevi asham vadai. Okay, there were two similarities to the tzibur in terms of the offerings. They both bring a par and they both don't bring an asham taloi, okay? Provincial guilt offering when you're not sure if you did something wrong. But now we're going to zigzag the other way and say, wait a minute. But the nasi and the kohen gadol both bring two offerings in the same way. What is that? So the avodah zara one, right? Remember, in avodah zara we said there's only two categories. There's the tzibur, they bring one, right, which is the par and the seir, then the seir, and the individual, the king, the kohen mashiach. All of them, if they sin unwittingly with avodah zara, they bring a seirah, the female goat. So now you see, number one, they're similar in that way, the nasi and the kohen gadol. Number two, when it comes to an asham vadai, which is a totally different kind of korban, but this is you bring, for example, we saw in Shvuot about Shvuat Pikadon, if they lie about saying, I don't have this, it's called an asham gzelot you bring. Or me'ilah, if they misuse consecrated property. That's the same korban. They're kohen and nasi, they're all the same as any individual. So they bring the same korban there. So you see they're similar, it's similar to the nasi. So then you would say the opposite, which is ma nasi mevi b'shigat ma'aseh, af mashiach mevi b'shigat ma'aseh. And then you would think, okay, we're almost done. You'd think it's like the nasi, just like the nasi brings just by doing a mistaken action with no unwitting erroneous ruling, it would be the same for the kohen mashiach. That's why we need the drasha, okay? Because in the end, logic can go either way. You can make an argument to say the kohen is like the tzibur. You can make an argument to say the kohen gadol is like the nasi, like the king. So we fall flat, and therefore the Gemara says, the braita says, that's why you need la'ashmat ha'am. Okay, this is a classic structure of a midrash halacha, right? Where we have the halacha, we connect it to a pasuk, but then we suggest, oh, maybe there's a different way to learn it, and why do we need the pasuk? In the end, you come back to, we needed the pasuk. This pasuk and this drasha we're going to come back to a few times today. So therefore it says lashmat ha'am harei u'mashiach ketzibur, and again we're just going to repeat the halacha. Ma tzibur eno mevi ela al helem davar im shigat maaseh, af mashiach eno mevi ela al helem davar im shigat maaseh. Okay, so the first half of Amud Aleph is all one drasha to teach you. Lashmat ha'am teaches you that kohen mashiach is not going to be obligated their korban unless it has to have that the kohen gadol taught in a ruling by mistake, taught the wrong thing, and then by mistake followed the ruling, okay, without realizing he had made a mistake in the ruling. Ema, now they suggest, wait a minute, why don't you say, Matzibor horev asu acharav behora'ato chayavim? If we're really going to compare it to the tzibor, maybe you should take it even farther. What happens in the tzibor? Right, if just like in the tzibor, the Beit Din taught, and asu acharav behora'ato, they're chayavim, right? So, and then the people followed. If we're going to take this comparison, maybe we should take it all the way. Af Mashiach kishahora v'asu acharav behora'ato yechayav. Maybe just like the court, okay, this sounds like it's like Rabbi Meir. Just like the court has to bring a bull offering, because remember Rabbi Meir said the court's the one that brings the bull offering, when they teach an erroneous ruling and the people follow them, maybe the Kohen Gadol has to bring an offering when the Kohen Gadol teaches an erroneous ruling and the people follow, right? Which would make total sense based on the comparison. If we're going to compare it, then it should be completely comparable. Kohen teaches, the people sin, right? Follow his erroneous ruling, especially if we say he's kind of like the court, then he should bring the korban. But Talmud Lomar, there's a special pasuk which teaches you no. This is only when the Kohen Gadol himself sins. How do we know? V'yikriv al chatato asher chata. He brings the korban on the sin that he sinned. He transgressed, not somebody else. So from there we learn it's definitely comparable to the Paralel Davar Shel Tzibor, but only to an extent. Not to the extent that if the people sin, the Kohen Gadol is not responsible, based on his ruling. Right? What's the drasha? What do we learn from it? So this korban is only for what he himself sinned, not what other people did. Okay, now we just have to go back to this one line, and then we'll go to the next Mishnah. Amar Mar. Now this line said, this is going to be a bit of a circular thing again, but Mashiach bepal ve'emi v'yasham taloi. So now they want to know, right, when they were comparing things that are similar between the Mashiach, the Kohen Mashiach, and the communal offering, that both bring a bull, That's not what's interesting right now. We know they both bring a bull because the psukim say so. And they both don't bring this provisional guilt offering. Minale, how do we know the kohen gadol doesn't bring provisional guilt offering? Okay, the community, yes, it's not a communal offering, but maybe the kohen would bring an individual one, just like he brings a regular asham and a regular, right? And he has his own chatat. Maybe he'd also bring this asham taloi. Now we're going to quote the psukim in Vayikra Hey, where it talks about asham taloi. Dichtiv v'chiper alav kohen. Now don't confuse the kohen and the kohen. This is the kohen, not who sinned. This is the kohen who's bringing the offering of the person who brought the asham taloi to the Beit HaMikdash. So the kohen's working in the temple. He atones for the person who sinned. Now what does it say there? Al shigigato asher shagag. On the unwitting action that the person unwittingly did. Now, obviously, unwitting doesn't need to be repeated twice there. You could just say al shigato. Shigato means the unwitting action that the person did. You don't need to say asher shagag also. So what do we learn from this? Misha chatato v'shigigato shaveh. This only applies to someone whose sin and shgaga is the same, which really means, in other words, someone who brings a sin offering on only a shgaga and not with a hora'ah of the court. In other words, remember, there's two kinds of ways you bring this korban chatat. One is, I just sin unwittingly. That's what we're talking about, that the chet and the shgaga are the same. And then there's the person, like the kohen gadol and like the tzibor, who first there has to be this erroneous ruling, and then there's a shgaga. Okay, that's not included in this pasuk. Dichtiv, how do we know this? That the Mashiach is now Yatsa Mashiach she'ein shigato v'chatato shaveh. Okay, his chet and shgaga are not the same, and that's why he doesn't bring an asham taloi. How do we know that? Here comes the problem. Circular. You'll get here in a minute. Dichtiv la'ashmat ha'am, because it says in the pasuk la'ashmat ha'am. Harei Mashiach ketzibur, and therefore he's just like the tzibur, and therefore, right, his chet, his shgaga, and chatato are not shavim, and therefore he's not part of Asham Taloi. Now, what's the big problem here? If you caught it, if you didn't catch it, it's okay. I'll tell you the problem. We're trying to explain this line in the middle of the braita. Now, what was the structure of the braita? The braita started with Lashmata Am teaches you the kohen is like the tzibur, okay, and therefore, right, chet and shgaga are not the same, okay, according to this. Then it said maybe without that drasha we could have learned it by logic. And it puts the drasha to the side and ignores it right now. And only comes back to it at the end when we can't make a logical argument. Now in the logical argument they say one of the points is the kohen's not chayav and asham taloi. And now when we say, well, how did they know that? They say, well, because of the pasuk lashmat ha'am. But at that point, they didn't know the pasuk lashmat ha'am existed. I mean, they did, but at that line of reasoning, they put that aside completely, and they're looking at this outside of that. They're saying you could just make a logical argument. It's like when you do Excel and then you make a formula, and then it tells you, but that affects so not right. It's circular. It's connected to something that's connected to something else. Like you can't do that. We didn't learn that yet. So it says here, the Gemara says, Lashmat ha'am ad kan lo ka'amrle. They didn't say that yet at this point in the argument. They don't have that yet. To which the Gemara answers an interesting answer. El asham kedei nasba. They just stuck that in there, the asham taloi. In other words, it is true in the end, bottom line. So they stuck it in the middle, even though it doesn't really belong there. In other words, at that point in the logic, you really can't use that because that's based on the formula that we're going to use at the end. And we didn't get to that formula yet, so you can't use that right now. But they just threw it in anyway because they know it's a fact, and they just threw it in because they know everything, right? In other words, the braita knew they were going to get to Lashmat ha'am. It wasn't like they didn't know it at that point. So they threw it in. It's like a throw-in, but it's not really part of the solid argument because it can't be because it's only concluded later. Okay, new Mishnah. Now this Mishnah is missing something, and Rashi is going to fill in, and I'm going to go with Rashi on this one. Okay, it sounds like the kohen just teaches and does, which is what we thought the case was. But what they seem to be talking about, we'll see this later in the Gemara, is that at the same time the kohen was teaching his ruling, the Beit Din was issuing a different ruling. So the kohen issued his ruling, the Beit Din issued their ruling. Both were unwitting, erroneous rulings. And then the kohen followed his own ruling, and the people followed the court's ruling. So you end up with these two sacrifices, and that's what they're telling you. That mitkaper lo b'fnei atzmo. He brings his own korban. He doesn't join the parlin davar shel tzibur. And obviously he doesn't. It's not on the same sin, right? But the Mishnah is telling you, even if two erroneous rulings happen at the same time, and the people follow the court, and the kohen follows his own, the kohen gadol. Even if I say kohen today, we really mean the kohen gadol. Okay, so don't get confused. I might skip the word gadol, but I mean the high priest. So if the kohen gadol does his ruling and they do their ruling and he follows himself and his ruling and they follow their, they each bring their own separate korban. Horayim atzibor, but if he ruled with the court and asayim atzibor, and then he did the action with the majority of the people, mitkaper loim atzibor. So then he just brings the korban with the tzibor. He doesn't have to bring his own korban. She'ein beitin chayavim. Now here, this is a weird connection. Okay, how this connects is a good question, but it seems to be saying that since the criteria are the same, she'ein beitin chayavim ad shiru levatel mitzad ulekayim mitzad v'chein hamashiach. Because the criteria for these two are the same, which has to relate to a mitzvah that you keep some of the mitzvah and they were canceling some of the mitzvah. Okay, that we already know, right? For the parlim davar shel tzibor, comes the Mishnah and says v'chein Mashiach, and the Mashiach has the same criteria, and lo ba'avodat kochavim az shiru levatel mitzad ulekayim mitzad. And also for avodah zarah, when we move to Sefer Bamidbar and there's the mistaken, the people follow an erroneous ruling about idol worship, it's also bitul mitzvah kiyum mitzvah. Okay, it's not canceling an entire mitzvah. This line is a little hard to understand the Mishnah and what exactly it's doing here. It seems to be saying somehow there's this comparison, and that maybe explains the previous part why he'll join the tzibor because the criteria are the same. But it's a little bit of an open question. Now the Gemara starts Menani Mile. Where do we get this about the second part of the Mishnah, which is if he does the ruling with them and follows with the tzibor, he's going to bring the tzibor and not his own korban. Titano Rabbanan. Again, we're going to bring a braita, and again, we're going to have some of this back and forth. Not as much as before. Now, you might have thought, again, we're going to have a whole long-winded suggestion. You might have thought he brings his own korban. Vidinu, it would be logical. Why? Nasi mutza michlal yachid, Mashiach mutza michlal yachid. Now, we're going to start with the comparison to the nasi. Both the nasi and the Mashiach are separated out from the community. Now, now the nasi, for sure, it's obvious to them that if the nasi sins on his own, of course he has to bring his own unique korban. But if he sins with the people, of course he's going to be part of the community. So we would say the same thing. This basically means that these psukim that separate out the nasi and separate out the Mashiach, we're all talking about when they sin without the community. But if they sin with the community, they'll just be part of the community. To which they say, lo. Why would you learn it from the nasi? Now, here's a different logic to break the connection between the nasi and the kohen gadol, specifically in this case. And getting back to Yom Kippur, okay, we're already in Elul, so it's good to think about this. But when it comes to the nasi, we already have an example, a precedent, where the nasi gets atonement with the people. Where is that? The kohen gadol on Yom Kippur, what does he do? He brings a sacrifice for the people, and he brings special sacrifice for the kohen gadol himself. And he's not with the people. He doesn't get atonement with the people. He has his own special sacrifice for him and the kohanim. The nasi doesn't have his own separate sacrifice on Yom Kippur. He's already with the people. So you could say the nasi is with the people in the parling davar shel tzibor because the nasi is with the people on Yom Kippur. The kohen gadol, though, is not with the people on Yom Kippur. Has his own special korban. So maybe he'd have his own special korban even if he goes and sins with the community. It's a reasonable comparison because it's similar about sinning with the people. So because he doesn't have kapara with the people on Yom Kippur, maybe if he sins with this community, they all follow the court and the kohen gadol, and he follow with them, maybe he bring his own par. Talmud Lamar, again, drasha. Okay, so logic doesn't get us anywhere. We could go both directions. Talmud Lamar, al chatato asher chata. It's for the sin that he sinned. Okay, not with right. So haketzad. How does this work? Chata b'fnei atzmo, levi b'fnei atzmo. So it's chatato asher chata when he sinned by himself. But if he sinned with the people, then he gives it with the people. Now, what's the case? Now, here we're going to ask a question about this idea. Both of the cases where he sinned, right, where he was with the court, or he was parallel the court, and each one was ruling about something else. What exactly is the case? If he was an expert judge, and they were not expert judges, well, obviously he's going to bring his own korban, because their teaching was nothing. Because remember what we learned in the Mishnah? If the mufla wasn't there, the expert, and it was the other judges, but the expert wasn't there, then there's no paralim davar shel tzibur. So of course it's not going to bring the korban with them. They don't even bring a korban. And ubaya tuye kisba usira kol chaf. If that's the case, and it was not the main court, right? It was not the mufla. It wasn't the best judges. And the court ruled erroneously, and then the people followed. Each person has to bring their own individual sin offering. There's no paralim davar shel tzibur to cover everything. And therefore, obviously, he's going to bring his own kohen gadol offering. What if it's the reverse? They were experts, but he wasn't. And then he issued this ruling, well, that wouldn't count as the par kohen HaMashiach. Because in order to count as the par kohen HaMashiach, he has to be an expert. He has to be like a judge. He has to issue a ruling, and a ruling is only issued by someone who can issue a ruling. If he wasn't adept to do that, then it wouldn't count. Turning now to Amud Bet. So what's the case? Amar Papa, the obvious case. Kigon shayu muflim shnehem. You would have to have a case. The Mishnah is only talking about a case where he was a muflim, they were muflim. Okay, they were all experts. Now, Sever Abai Lemeimer. Abai thought to say, Chatam b'fnei atzmo v'asa b'fnei atzmo heichidami. It really should be Chatam, and he changed the nusach to Hora b'fnei atzmo, which is the line in the Mishnah. Hora b'fnei atzmo and asa b'fnei atzmo. In the case when he rules and they ruled on two different things, what's the case? According to Abaye, you need two things. Number one, they issued two different rulings. And number two, diyatve b'shnei makomot, and they were each sitting in two different places. V'kamore b'trei surei. So they were in two different places and they each taught different rulings. Sounds like he'd be saying if it was one place, then he would actually go with them, even if they were talking about two different isurim. To which Rava says to him, Rava, atu shnei makomot gormim? It's not the location that causes this split between them. Even if they're sitting in the same place. Because they were each ruling on two different topics, two different issues, it's considered split and different. Okay? Now, what does it mean, two different rulings? Now we're going to do a sugya that we saw before. It's going to be a repeat of it, but in a bit of a different way. It's obvious that if he ruled in chelev and they ruled on avodah zarah, each one issued a mistaken, erroneous ruling, right? And unwittingly they issued an erroneous ruling, then obviously we're going to say they don't bring the same korban. Why? Because, right, the mitzvah itself is a totally different mitzvah, avodah zarah and some other mitzvah, and chalukim b'korbanot, and the mistake, the korban that you bring for avodah zarah is completely different from the korban that you bring for chelev. Chelev is just the bull, and the avodah zarah is the bull and the seir. So if the kohen ruled on the chelev, he would have to bring a bull. If the court ruled on avodah kochavim, they'd have to bring a bull and a goat. So therefore, right, then they say jehu b'par v'hem b'par v'seir. Tahakamai tuhani seir v'hulamaite. You know, there's the main difference being they're just highlighting in case it wasn't obvious. It's true they both bring the par, so knock out that. But they bring a seir, the goat, and he doesn't. So obviously, in that case, you're not going to say he would bring with them because the korbanot are completely different. Besides, the isurim are different. The choshaken, all the more so if it was the reverse. Hu ba'avodah kochavim. You'll see in a minute why the reverse is very obvious. Vehem bechelev dechalukim bekorbonatehem legambre. In this case, there's a complete difference in the korbanot. There, at least, there was an overlap of the par. Right? Just they added the seir and he didn't. But here, now remember what happens. If a kohen does the avodah zarah, that's where we started. I mentioned those psukim. What does he bring? Like the individual, like the nasi, he brings a seirah, a female goat offering. And what do they bring if they do chelev? A par. Okay, there's no overlap at all. So especially in that case where there's complete no overlap. Ela. Remember this, right? There's two different kinds of chelev. There's the one that's on the stomach and there's the one that's on the small intestine. Those, what if he ruled on one and they ruled on the other? Now, while they both bring the same korban, because he brings a par for his mistaken ruling and they bring a par for the paralim davar shel tzibur. But since they learned from two different parts of the same pasuk, maybe these are viewed as two different isurim. Or maybe we say no. Their korban is the same, and even their isur is the same because they're both chelev, even though they're different kinds of chelev. And even if you say it's one chelev, right? That's all one chelev. You can see where this is going. Hu b'chelev v'heim b'dam mahu. What if he ruled on chelev and they ruled on dam? Now here, what do you have? It's mi amrina b'tamayu hapagina. There, the reasons are different, meaning the psukim, the isurim are different. O dilma, or do we say kevan shavim b'korban, batar korban as or maybe they have the same korban, right? They do have the same korban because he brings a par, they bring a par, and maybe then he would bring with them teku. So we don't know. Okay, so this was just a big open question about what does it mean a different ruling, right? Where the Mishnah, even though it didn't say it explicitly, but it's obvious that they understood the Mishnah to be that he taught one thing, the added words are, and they taught something else. What is the something else is not 100% clear. Some possibilities are very clear. Some, we don't know. Okay, moving now to the next line. She'ein beitin, the next line of the Mishnah. She'ein beitin chayavin ad she'u levatel miktzat ulekayem miktzat. Okay, this was the halacha we saw already, that when you bring a parlim davar shel tzibor, when it's bitol miktzat kiyu miktzat, and what our Mishnah was trying to tell us was, same thing for the Kohen HaMashiach. Has to be not that he tried to uproot an entire mitzvah, but he messed up on some details. Minnal, and where do we get this? And this is just chazara on what we learned already. Kedamrina bi'idach pirkin. It's funny when the Gemara does this, like we learned in the other chapter, right? V'ne'elam daval davar v'lo kol haguf. Remember this? Ne'elam, they darshaned it, v'ne'elam mi daval, right? It eluded them, right? There was an absence of knowledge about something, meaning not the complete something, but partial. V'chein HaMashiach. Okay, so now where do we get to that the Mashiach has the same criteria? There it was only in the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibor pasuk. So we're going to go back to the drasha we started with. Dichtiv la'ashmat ha'am harei Mashiach ketzibur. Okay, the words la'ashmat ha'am come to compare the Mashiach to the tzibur. So again, we're comparing it for all sorts of things. First it was Helem Davar and Shigiyat Ma'aseh that you needed, and now it's Bitul Miktzat, Kiyum Miktzat. Below ba'avodat kochavim. Now it said, okay, let's read that line again. It's a bit of a double negative kind of thing. Below ba'avodat kochavim ad shi'u levatel miktzat ulekayim miktzat, right? And not in avodah zarah until, meaning you're only going to be chayav in avodah zarah, the parlim davar shel tzibur, ad shi'u levatel miktzat ulekayim miktzat. So now, minalam, where do we get this from? Detanu Rabbanan. Okay, so now we have to figure this out because we don't have v'ne'elam daval. It doesn't say that there. So how do we get it? By the avodah zarah pasuk. Again, we're going to suggest something that we'll later reject and say no, but we have a drasha. Since avodah zarah was isolated from all the other psukim, right? Because it has a whole separate section just for itself. So maybe it's different, completely different. And maybe you're chayav if the court rules, go worship avodah zarah. Okay, completely. There's no avodah zarah from the Torah. Maybe you would be obligated. No. Ne'emar kan me'enei. V'ne'emar lahalan me'enei. Okay, let's read the psukim. So, parlim davar shel tzibor. Im kol adat Yisrael yishku v'ne'elam davar me'enei hakahal. Okay, there was an absence of knowledge from the eyes of the community. Why it's right? Eyes is like kind of a unique word here. Also, by avodah zarah, it says, if from the eyes of the community it was done unwittingly, also the word eyes there, eyes there, eyes there. That's what we call Gzera Shava. Ma lahalan bebeitin, av kanami bebeitin. So the first thing we learned, by the way, never said court ruled any issued or erroneous ruling in the avodah zarah psukim in Bamidbar. So first they learn, just like in Vayikra there, when it said me'inei akahal, it was the court ruled. Therefore, also in avodah zarah, it's the court ruling. And ma lahalan davar v'lo kol haguf, av kanami davar v'lo kol haguf. And also there, it was part of a davar and not the whole thing, also here. Okay, that's all Gzera Shava. New Mishnah. Ein chayavim ela halalim davarim shigat ma'aseh. This sounds like it's kind of repeating where we started, but we seem to want to stress this. I guess it wasn't explicit in the first Mishnah, even though it was kind of implicit. But now they say, I don't really know why the Mishnah is kind of repeating this, but Ein chayavim ela halalim davarim shigat ma'aseh. So you're only chayav the parlim davar shel tzibur if you have a halim davar, meaning the court accidentally issued an erroneous ruling, with a shigigat ma'aseh, and then there's an action to follow by the people. V'chein HaMashiach. Same thing with the kohen, okay, where the kohen has to first issue an erroneous ruling, and then the kohen has to follow the ruling. V'lo ba'avodat kochavim, and again we have this v'lo ein chayavim. Okay, it's a little bit different here. Some people get rid of the word lo. Ba'avodat kochavim ein chayavim ela lahalim davarim shigat ma'aseh. It makes a lot more sense if you get rid of the word lo. Anyway, b'avodat kochavim, what it means is either which way, whether you have that word or not. In avodah zarah, you're only obligated also. In other words, that section about the se'ira for avodah, about the par and se'ira for avodah zarah in the case of the community following avodah zarah, also only helim davar with shigat maaseh. Now, what's not clear in this Mishnah, and this we're going to end with today, is that line also true for the kohen Mashiach for avodah zarah, or is it not? So one way to read the Mishnah is, where did it say v'chein Mashiach? In the middle of the Mishnah. Actually, just like the previous Mishnah. And actually just like the Mishnah coming up. But then it's kind of splits. In other words, the first part, helim davar and shigat maaseh, that's for the kohen Mashiach. So the way the Gemara is first going to read this Mishnah is that when it says about avodah zarah that you need also helim davar and shigat maaseh, it's only for the parlim davar shel tzibur. The kohen Mashiach, who sins by avodah zarah, is actually not going to be that way, or maybe is. Okay, we're going to have a whole debate about this. So first the Gemara says minalan detanu rabbanan. How do we know that it's helim davar and shigat maaseh by the community? And then we'll go, how do we know by the kohen, which we know already. Once we learned by the community, lashmada am, we learned it by the kohen. How do we learn by the community? Detanu rabbanan yishku. Okay, that's where it says imadat Yisrael, kol adat Yisrael yishku. They'll make a mistake. Yachol yu chayavim al shigat maaseh. Yishku sounds like shkaga, like they just did an erroneous, they made a mistake by accident. Talmud lamal yishku v'ne'elam davar. Okay, but it says more than that. It says kol adat Yisrael yishku v'ne'elam davar meinei kahal. It has to be halamat davar, that they didn't realize something, meaning the court issued the wrong ruling. So from there they learn en chayavin elal helim davar shigat maaseh. Chen Mashiach minalan. Where do we get the kohen gadol? Same thing. Daftiv lashmada am. Whatever's true for that, right? Harei Mashiach ketzibur. Now we get to this avodah zarah part. V'lo b'avodat kochavim elal helim davar shigat maaseh. Minalan. Where do we get this from? Detanu rabbanan. The braita says. So first we have to understand, how do we know avodah zarah is also helim davar and shigat maaseh, and not just that the people actually, all the tzibur just went and started worshiping avodah zarah. How do we know it has to first start with an erroneous ruling to bring this par and seir? Again, it's obvious to us from what we've learned until now, but the braita wants to know how we know that. Okay, this is the big theme of today, right? This was isolated out. It was separated out from the general, right? Because the general was already in Vayikra. Why do you need to separate out of avodah zarah? You might have thought, and this is what we said before also, you might have thought, not bitul miktzah chiyuv miktzah also here. You might have thought, al shigat maaseh, maybe just if the people all decided to worship idols without any erroneous ruling. But ne'amar kameineh v'ne'amar la'lan meineh, again the same drasha we saw before. We actually saw that all in the braita before, but now this one is a little bit expanded one, and since we're bringing it for this topic, they wanted to mention it now. Now they go to my point, which is, it doesn't say v'chein Mashiach. So they assume, therefore, it's not true. For the kohen Mashiach who sins by avodah zarah, it could be just the kohen gadol went and accidentally worshipped avodah zarah. No erroneous ruling. Mani, in which case, who does the Mishnah match? And now we're going to see it's a machloket tanaim between Rabbi and the rabbis. So our Mishnah must be Rabbi's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Ditanya. Mashiach, now we're going to see their machloket. Mashiach b'avodat kochavim. Rabbi omer b'shigigat maaseh v'chachamim omrim b'helim davar. Here's the machloket. Rabbi says, now it makes sense, because in Vayikra you could say they're split, right? And there's Lashmada Am, that compares it. But in Bamidbar we have one case of parlim davar shel tzibur. We have one case which includes the individual, the nasi, and the kohen, a Mashiach. So if that case includes all of them, then they should all be the same. And that's why Rebbe says, shigigat maaseh. It's all the same. The kohen's like the rest of them. They just accidentally made a mistake and started worshiping idols. The rabbis say no, it's helim davar. Now, Shavin, they both agree, shebesi'ira. V'shavin she'emi v'asham talui. Okay, they both agree that the Kohen HaMashiach, the Asham Talui is a totally different issue, which we actually talked about. Kohen Gadol never brings an Asham Talui. But here, the main thing is, the Se'ira, which is the female goat that you're supposed to bring for Avodah Zarah, they all agree that those psukim, after the tzibur of Avodah Zarah, those psukim at the end of Bamidbar, there, that chapter, are talking specifically, include the Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen Gadol has to bring the Se'ira, if he worships Avodah Zarah, but they disagree about when he brings it. Does it have to also have a He'elim Davar or not? So now, they're going to say, okay, so that was all to say our Mishnah much Rebbe because it doesn't say B'chein Mashiach. Now they're just going to argue at that point. Okay, they're going to say, v'tizbara. Look at the next Mishnah. Do you really think that? Because the next Mishnah is talking about zdono karein shigato chatat. Now there it's the same structure. It says the Beit Din's only chayavim if they taught something where if you did intentionally it would be karet, and if not, chatat. And v'chein Mashiach, and same for the kohen gadol. And then it says, also within avodah zarah, it has to be something they would get karet for. And it doesn't say v'chein Mashiach. Now, nobody thinks that it doesn't apply also the kohen gadol there. It's for sure true for the kohen gadol. So the v'chein Mashiach in that Mishnah clearly goes on the whole thing. Therefore, you could read our Mishnah the same way. That's what they're going to say. So, Mikatani, right? It doesn't say v'chein Mashiach, Mikatani. It doesn't say v'chein Mashiach. Elatane havu wadila. It says v'chein Mashiach, which refers to line 1. And that also refers to the line after v'chein Mashiach. And therefore, Hachanami will say the same thing in our Mishnah. Taneha v'wadin laha. Okay, and also, by the way, in the previous Mishnah, it was the same. So now we just want to finish up with my time of Rebbe. What's Rebbe's logic? Why he says it's shigat maaseh for the kohen. Amar Kra. Now, when it talks about in that section in Bamidbar about the individual who sins with avodah zarah, it says v'chiper kohen al hanefesh hashogeget b'cheta b'shkaga. That's a lot of words on the person who is shogeget in his sin b'shkaga. Okay, by accident. Hanefesh ze Mashiach. Hashogeget ze nasi. Okay, that's where he's going to derive. All these people are included here, right? Again, by the way, the chiper kohen is the kohen who's working in the temple, not the kohen gadol here. So the kohen who's atoning for the person who did the sin is atoning for both the Mashiach, if the Mashiach did it, the kohen, if the kohen, the nasi, if the nasi did it. Bechet'a b'shkaga. So what is bechet'a b'shkaga? Comes Rebbe and says, that's my proof. Chet ze b'shkaga yehe. It's just a shkaga. Okay, meaning the person just sinned without an erroneous rule. V'Rabbanan savrei. No, what it means there is mishachet o b'shkaga. It's coming to talk about someone whose sin is by just shkaga alone. He basically says the kohen is bechaper on someone who is shogeg, who's just did shigat maaseh, not for the kohen of Mashiach. He would need also helem davar and shigat maaseh. V'shavin shebesira ki yachid, but they all agree that the sira. And why do they all agree the sira? Minalan damar kra v'im nefesh achat, because it says one soul. Okay, one individual, basically any individual. Okay, and that's how they both get that. The korban is the same, but they differ about what case is the kohen Mashiach bring the korban just like the rest of them, just for shigat maaseh. That's Rebbe. The rabbis think no. The kohen of Mashiach's korbanot are always helem davar and shigat maaseh, also in avodah zarah. That's a big machloka between them. Okay, what did we do today? We basically, I'll just kind of talk about it globally. What we did was we made a lot of comparisons to the Kohen HaMashiach and the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur. And we learned all sorts of halachot that are true for that, mainly from this drasha Lashmat Ha'am. And again, it conceptually puts them in a totally different category, that we have these two categories split between communal-oriented ones and ones that are, people who are in community, we're responsible for others and others' actions, even though the Kohen himself sinned, but it's because of his responsibility to the community, versus the nasi, who is also a communal leader, but in a different way, not in a teaching manner. Okay, so his is different. His is more, it's individual sin that has a higher level because he's a community leader, but a different type of community leader. This raises also a question about leaders and different types of leaders and, the different position that the nasi and the kohen gadol had. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and don't forget to register for the sealing.